that watercolor and flowers go beautifully together, but I want to show you how to create a couple of container options. This is something that is not really taught very often. Kind of as a bonus, I thought this is so important and so easy. So let's do it. I want to show you how to paint two types of containers really easily. One is kind of like the classic mason jar, a little bit like this container, but we'll give it a little bit of a blue tint. And another is a wrapper around a bouquet. So either of these can be used for your flowers, whether you do one or two stems, daintily gathered from the backyard, that kind of a painting, or you want to do a full bouquet. This is going to come in handy, and you can pick whichever you want to do. All right, for both of these, you're going to need 3 brushes. 2 of them will be for both, and the extra, the one with the 3, will be the jar. But believe me, if you have these brushes, it'll make everything a lot easier. In truth, though, in watercolor, you can always just use your round brush. You just really have to rely on your drawing skills and do a lot of filling in. So I really like to use bigger brushes whenever possible, so I don't have to scribble the paint and the water in, because then it won't flow as beautifully, because that puddle will be kind of more of like, I don't know, a streak that you create with your snow boot on a slushy day, rather than splashing a puddle of water down and then letting the paint float through it. For our mason jar, we will use a large square flat brush. It's just going to be about 1 inch wide. This is a size 20. These are all Master's Touch brand from Hobby Lobby. Then I'll go in with a smaller square brush to create the rim, and for details, a round brush. So I've got 20, 9, and 10 in terms of sizes. I don't like to talk about sizes that much because they vary so much from brand to brand. So if you want to compare the size of a fingernail, a thumb, that might be more helpful than actually looking at the sizes. For the burlap kind of wrapper, which you can also make a newspaper wrapper if you so choose, or a tissue wrapper. We are going to start again with the large flat brush and then just add more details with the round one. So get your supplies out. In terms of colors, I like to use a nice turquoise for the ball jar, and of course for burlap, a yellow ochre would be great. We'll also go into something a little darker to push those values a little darker. So just take it a step up, a darker blue, or with the burlap, a darker brown. I'm going to work on these simultaneously. Hopefully that isn't too confusing for you. I like to do that because that way I juggle drying times. So while I'm waiting for something to dry, I can work on something else, and then this is ready to come back to. It could also be my mom brain that makes me think that way. But the bonus is that then you end up with 2 paintings instead of 1 for the same amount of time, which sounds amazing. If you're going to paint your bouquet on the same sheet of paper, I suggest that you make your container smaller than half the size of your page. Aesthetically, our eyes likes the rule of thirds. Goes like this. If we cut this into thirds, then we like this area to have a focal, this to be a bit of a focal point, and then we have either some space up here or some smaller details. Now I'm not going to make my jar that small. I like to get my paints nice and wet so that they are ready to work. You'll notice if you followed me before, I like to use fluid paints because that means that the paint is already ready to flow, and that's what I love. Okay, and also I don't usually draw, so we're gonna go straight for it. Just to break the page, let's go straight down the page in one fell swoop. This is the center of our jar. With a little more paint, I can create an oval up here, keeping my brush facing the top of the page, the top of the paper, not moving it, so that it really easily creates that ellipse. Ellipse is just a fancy word for oval. Then I'm going to create another ellipse, which is the body of our huge jar, and fill that in. This is also where the water might be. And finally, I'm going to create some bases for my ellipses before I fill it in. So this is the top of the jar. Look how easily I can create the rim of that jar by just doing one brush stroke that I smoothed out a little more by using the very width of the brush. And since I'm not quite sure where this ends and I don't want to get that wrong, I'm going to just begin extending this line down. My paint and my water is still wet, so they are blending together nicely. If yours is not, all you need to do is add more water. And you're starting to see the body of this jar come together. Now let's work on the very bottom. You can decide where you want that to be depending on how deep you want your container to be, how many flowers you're planning on watercolor picking and placing here. And I'll just fill. You can really see the line of the first brush stroke that I created, but just by re-wetting the area and dropping in more paint, this is the wet on wet method, we can really kind of hide it nicely. We're just adding a little more paint to the mix. And in order to do that, we want to give it a fluid area to flow through. All right, I'm going to connect these up here with kind of a rounded edge. We're going to let that dry and move on to our burlap wrapper. I'm using the same brush, so it's kind of like a good warm-up for using the same movements. Just like I did before, I am going to get my paint nice and wet. This time I'm using a yellow ochre, but I want it to be pretty watered down. This is really just going to offer the shape of the burlap fabric, and then we'll add in those details, all those threads and things that might take you a little while to do. All right, a wrapper for a bouquet is a triangular shape. It might gather here at the center with a ribbon or, you know, some thread, yarn stuff, and then fan out just a tiny bit down here. This time I'm using my brush a little differently. I'm going to use it this way perpendicularly to kind of use it to draw with, and then I will fill. We want kind of a scalloping going on with the two ends of that fabric wrapping around. So I'm going to go ahead while I have my brush wet, create kind of a leaf shape. It's kind of nice to have one side that's really angular and one that's a little more fluid and organic. These are these little things that we notice that just kind of create a little visual interest. If you want to add even more bulk, then you can create even more nuances with the shape, so it's not just a basic triangle type shape. And then down here we have kind of a, I don't know, some polygon of some sort, like a trapezoid, right? So we've got a flat line where that string might be. It widens out a little bit here at the bottom. It's looking like a kimono or something like that. And if you want, you can add some details back here, some hints of the wrapper itself. But if you're going to paint flowers, then I recommend you wait on that, create your flowers, and then add this kind of back layer of the fabric that's wrapping behind it separately at the end. Personally, just for the sake of this painting not looking totally bizarre, since I'm going to add in my flowers later digitally in Photoshop. Love doing that, love teaching that in watercolor build. Then I'm going to go ahead and fill in that back shape. You can add a little bit of a light color here. We know that that is going to be a ribbon, but if you want it to be a different color, then leave it blank. We are done with our big brush, and we're now moving on to a smaller brush. Going back to the jar, letting my burlap dry. Look at how pretty this dried. So something about watercolor is that it dries lighter than when you first see it. So you might be a little disappointed because you wanted it to be more punchy and rich in color and found that it dried a little more dull. But in working with the wet on wet method, you get to see the paint kind of work its way through that puddle that you create for it to move through, and it makes it so much more interesting and captivating to look at. Personally, that's my opinion. I love me some wet on wet. Now we're just going to come in with some values. Like I said, a little darker blue. My teal is looking mighty bluish, so I might add a little green just to spice it up a little bit, but still keep it as my darker color. All right, now we get to play a little bit with the shape of our jar. The jars tend to be darker here at the bottom where the color gathers, that colored glass gathers. We can add a little bit of a border. We can add a hint of the depth of the base of the jar. You can also do that for the water that it has. And I'm going to use my brush this way, perpendicularly. Whenever I want a nice thin line that's really straight, I like to use this square brush. It really helps me to create a straighter line, much more so than the round brush. The round brush is great for what we call line quality. With the round brush, you can make thick and thin lines just by pressing down or letting up on the pressure. But with a flat brush, you have less freedom and therefore more predictability with the shape that it creates. And what's really great about it is for this purpose, just as we did the rim with a big brush, we're going to do the rim again with a smaller width of the same shape. And you can see that it creates a nice consistent line that then I can use to guide my future lines with. I can even use the very corner of my round brush to create some ridges up here at the top. If I so choose. And just make really subtle lines. This was wet, so these lines are gonna smush together a little bit. It's kind of nice, very subtle lines, because we don't really see stripes per se on these. If you want to get real fancy, after you create the rim of your jar, very important, get that definition in. It really encourages us to see that, you know, all come together. But if you want to get really fancy, you can create some kind of reflective lines, some depth lines with this flat brush, following along the edge but not coming right up to the edge, so you get more of a sense of the shape. You can do that also with white. I'm going to use some Chinese white, which sometimes comes in your watercolor palettes. It's not a very opaque white because it is watercolor. If you want an opaque white, then use something like an acrylic ink to create some more reflections. But we are just about done. You can always add more when it comes to this point. You can say, oh, I want more light or I want more dark. This is the point where you add more contrast in highlights. And people differ on how they want their piece to look. You might like a more muted look and say, no, a little low contrast is great because I want those flowers to really pop. Or maybe you want a lot more definition. Maybe you want to create more of a defined space with the water. It's the same process that we did before in creating the jar. Just now you're going to add that bit of depth with that same shape, round at the top, flow down. And if you really want this wet on wet feel, then make a big puddle for that paint to flow. But if you are nervous about letting the paint flow however it wants to, I would leave it just like this. You've got a nice jar. You've got a feel for its volume. It's looking so good. I would say this is done. Could be pushed a little bit more with a little bit of value and just going a little darker in smaller areas. And for that, you'll use your round brush. Just for the sake of those of you who are so curious, I'll do just a tiny bit here. Consider the corners to be your darkest areas. Consider the bottom of where things fall, where they overlap. You have some shading, you have some shadow, but it doesn't take very many touches on the page to give it that definition, does it? Do you already see it coming together with just a little bit of dark here and there? Just beautiful. Beautiful. All right, let's wrap up our burlap wrapper. And this will be a tiny bit more tedious. With my round brush, I will get pure yellow ochre. If that's not dark enough to show, then go even darker. But this is when we add in just a few texture lines. Now, something that I want to point out that I'm doing here is I'm barely touching the page with my brush. And that way it kind of lifts up and pushes down. And that is that line quality that I was telling you about. Something really nice that the round brush can give us. A variety of widths of line. As much as you can, be uniform, but you can also just really play with how these lines are showing where things are going. You know, they're showing how the fabric is bending, really adding a lot of nice texture to it. And don't worry, it's not going to look like zebra stripes for too long because we are going to cross them in the other direction fairly soon. Still trying to make sure that I'm following the lines here. Make it make sense for our viewers. They're going to appreciate that. And now we'll go horizontally. Again, we're needing to think about what is the volume going on here. Does it get a little tight here and a little round there? These really show through. It's kind of like when you wear horizontal or vertical stripes on your clothes. They really give away the curvature that they are wrapping around. Ooh, these are all vertical, so I'm in the clear. But they say don't wear horizontal stripes, right? Because they just show all your curvaceousness, which I don't think is a bad thing. I don't. There's a time for everything, I suppose. I'm going at this pretty quickly for you to just pause, take your time if you need to. I also like to have kind of a loose look with these kinds of textures. It adds some contrast in even how you treat things in your painting. So you can treat your flowers really detailed and then your containers, your wrapper very loosely. Adding a bit of frayed ends here to the edges of our burlap. So fun. Got to be careful. It can start to look kind of hairy. All right, let's go for our twine. And I'm going to keep it fairly simple, just a few lines with a darker brown. And of course, a few dangling strands. How many times does it wrap around? You can pick. You can pick. You can also pick if the border of one of your burlap ends might be a little darker. Oh, I could just keep going. I enjoy painting so much. You can get 100 free reference images. That's a lot. 100 free reference images for you to paint all the flowers if you feel ready to just go for it. Click below for that and you'll get it in your email. How awesome is that? So you'll have a variety of flowers to choose from to place within your beautiful containers. Follow me here at Watercolor Devo on YouTube for more, and also subscribe to Tip Tuesdays, where I send out a weekly email to help you get creative, inspired, and even show you how to paint a quick step-by-step tutorial every week delivered to your inbox. It's free and also linked below.